The afternoon light filtered through my curtains and honeyed ribbons, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors of my quiet, suburban home. I had just finished my daily ritual of chamomile tea, savoring those final sips as if they might somehow fill the emptiness that had become my companion since Thomas had passed 5 years ago. The silence that once felt like a sanctuary now seemed to press against the walls, a constant reminder of absence. When the doorbell echoed through the house, it startled me from my reverie. I wasn't expecting anyone. Our neighborhood on Maple Lane was the sort where spontaneity had long ago surrendered to routine and polite distance. Standing on my porch was Richard, my next-door neighbor, a man I knew primarily through brief exchanges about the weather and compliments on his immaculate rose bushes. In his early 40s, Richard possessed a quiet confidence that contrasted with the unmistakable anxiety now etched across his features. His eyes, normally calm and assured, darted briefly over his shoulder before meeting mine. "Hello, Eleanor," he said, his voice hushed yet determined. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," I replied, gesturing him inside with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Is everything all right?" Richard hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing it represented a significant boundary beyond mere physical space. When he finally stepped inside, something in his demeanor shifted, the carefully maintained facade of neighborly detachment giving way to something raw and unguarded. "I need your help," he confessed, running his fingers through his hair as I led him to the living room sofa. "It's rather personal." I settled into my armchair across from him, aware of an unfamiliar tension humming between us. "Of course, Richard. What's troubling you?" His hands clasped tightly together, knuckles whitening slightly before he spoke. "I know we've never been close, Eleanor, but I've always admired how you've carried yourself since Thomas passed. The grace with which you've rebuilt your life, it's remarkable. And right now, I need someone with your perspective." His words caught me off guard. I had become so accustomed to invisibility, the widow who tended her garden and kept to herself, that the recognition of my strength through another's eyes felt like rediscovering a forgotten part of myself. Richard explained his situation with careful precision. His younger sister, Sarah, was navigating the turbulent waters of a difficult divorce. While he had been her steadfast support, he recognized the limitations of his help. What Sarah needed, he believed, was the wisdom of someone who understood profound loss and renewal, someone like me. "She's in a fragile state," Richard admitted, his voice softening. "I think hearing from someone who has weathered their own storm might help her see beyond the current darkness." As he spoke, I observed the subtle manifestations of his concern, the slight furrow between his brows, the way his fingers occasionally traced the seam of his trousers. There was something disarming about his willingness to reveal vulnerability, to acknowledge that he couldn't be everything his sister needed. "I'd be happy to meet with Sarah," I said, surprising myself with the immediacy of my response. "If you think my experience might offer her some comfort." The relief that washed over his features was palpable, transforming his expression in a way that made me suddenly aware of how handsome he was, a thought I quickly set aside. In the days that followed, as we arranged Sarah's visit, Richard began appearing at my door with increasing frequency. Our conversations, once limited to pleasantries, expanded into rich explorations of our lives. He spoke of his architectural firm, his childhood in Vermont, the novel he'd been attempting to write for years. I shared stories of my teaching career, my passion for classical music, the travels Thomas and I had planned but never took. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching twilight descend over the neighborhood, Richard turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I never anticipated that asking for your help would lead to this." He gestured vaguely between us, at the invisible threads of connection that had begun to form. "It's been unexpected." I nodded, unable to articulate the complex emotions stirring within me, guilt intermingled with a cautious joy, as if I were betraying a memory by embracing something new. Sarah's visit became a catalyst. She arrived with a cautious demeanor of someone who has forgotten how to trust, her eyes reflecting the particular exhaustion that comes from emotional rather than physical exertion. As we talked over tea and homemade scones, I watched her gradually unfurl, our shared experiences of loss, though different in nature, creating a bridge between us. "How did you know when you were ready to move forward?" she asked, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. I considered her question carefully. "I'm not sure that you ever know with certainty," I admitted. "One day, you simply realize that your grief has transformed into something you carry rather than something that carries you." When Richard came to collect Sarah later that afternoon, the gratitude in his eyes contained something more, a question, perhaps, or a possibility. He embraced me briefly, his arms lingering a moment longer than friendship might dictate. "Thank you, Eleanor," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "You've helped Sarah immensely. And you've reminded me of something I'd forgotten about myself as well." That evening, Richard returned with a bottle of wine and a vulnerability I hadn't witnessed before. Over dinner in my rarely used dining room, illuminated by candlelight that softened the edges of reality, he confessed that his frequent visits had become about more than his sister's well-being. "I've found myself looking forward to our conversations in a way I haven't experienced in years," he admitted, his gaze steady but uncertain. "There's an ease between us that I didn't expect to find at this stage of life." I felt a flutter of panic, mixed with an unmistakable current of anticipation. At 58, I had considered that chapter of my life firmly closed, romance belonging to memories rather than possibilities. "I'm not sure I remember how to do this," I confessed, my voice barely audible. Richard's smile was gentle. "Perhaps we can remember together." When he leaned across the table and brushed his lips against mine, the kiss was tentative yet deliberate, an acknowledgement of our mutual trepidation and desire. It carried the weight of our respective histories and the lightness of newfound connection. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of rediscovery. Richard and I navigated our emerging relationship with careful consideration, aware of the complexities of merging lives that had been independently constructed. Sarah continued to heal, strengthened by our growing support network. Looking back, I recognize now that Richard's request for help had never been solely about Sarah. It had been about creating an opening, a legitimate reason to breach the careful distance we had maintained. In reaching out to me, he had offered us both the opportunity to recognize that sometimes the heart's capacity for renewal is its most remarkable quality. What began as a favor between neighbors had evolved into something neither of us had been seeking but both had perhaps unconsciously desired, proof that even in life's quieter chapters, profound transformation remains possible.